Hello, and thank you for joining the Leadership Live webinar, How I Built One of the Largest E-commerce Brands of the Middle East. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during today's presentation, you may do so at any time via the Q&A tab on your screen. This call is being recorded. It is now my pleasure to turn the call over to Meg Rogers. Please go ahead.
Good morning and probably good evening to some of you. My name is Meg Rogers. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of the JWMI Management Institute, and welcome everybody to our latest event in our JWMI Leadership Live series. We are thrilled today to welcome Mona Ataya. Mona is the CEO and founder of mumsworld.com, and I'm sure, as you will learn, has really proven herself to be one of the Middle East's most prominent and successful female entrepreneurs. And I think what really has inspired me about learning more about Mona is, not only has she been able to build great business, but she's also been a cultural agent of change for female entrepreneurs in the region, as well as female professionals. A little bit about Mom's World. Mom's World is really setting the gold standard in e-commerce for the shopping experience for all things mother, child, and baby in the Middle East, reaching more than 2.5 million mothers across the region since it was founded in 2011. Today, the site offers over 250,000 products and delivers to over 20 different countries, as well as building a very highly engaged online community with mothers, and always delivering on its promise to find the most convenient and cost-effective way to deliver its products. Most interestingly, I think, is not only is Mom's World's ability to provide such a compelling e-commerce platform, but is really the story of how the company was founded. With its recent sale of majority stake to Saudi Arabia's Tamer Group, the company is now one of the highest funded female-led e-commerce businesses in the region, and has collected a slew of awards, being recognized as Best Small Business, Online Retailer, and Customer Service. And not to embarrass her, but Mona herself has really been one of the Middle East region's most recognized entrepreneurs. There's probably a list of 100 awards that she has won over the past several years. But just to name a few, UAE's most prominent women in tech, listed as one of the Middle East's most powerful businesswomen in 2020 and 2021 by Forbes, and also recognized as one of the 30 most influential women in the Arab world by Arabian Business. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome Mona to JWMI's Leadership Live session. So welcome, Mona, and thank you for staying late this evening. I know you're around the world in Dubai, I believe, so thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And thank you for the warm and very kind introduction.
Well, great. I think, one of the things that we were actually just chatting about in our pre-conference is, I think for many of our students at the Jack Welch Management Institute, like yourself, they sort of start out on a traditional career path. You yourself obviously had, I think early on, had some pretty prominent roles in two very large CPG companies, P&G and J&J. And then something happens, they get, inspired along the way, be it sort of, have that struck by lightning moment, with the perfect idea, finding a space in the market, or maybe just the right opportunity. I'm wondering if you could, before we jump into Mom's World, if you could talk a little bit about your personal story and what sort of led you from the sort of the comfortable world of corporate life to, I'm sure, what is which most people describe as sort of an enduring entrepreneurial discomfort and professional as somebody who founded their own business.
Thank you. So I did start my career very traditionally. My first job was fresh out of undergrad with Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was in the brand management soap sector of P&G. And I spent the first, I would say, 3 years in intense learning mode. So I was surrounded by super smart people, high achievers, and a tremendous amount of resources, to allow me to learn and develop. So I really looked at my first few years and the beginning of my career as absorption and development, personal development. I remember I would walk into the office at 6 a.m. and I would leave past midnight, and everyone would say, "You're crazy. Why do you come in so early? And why do you leave so late?" And for me, it was an adrenaline rush. I loved it because every hour was a learning. And I've always been driven by growth and development, personal growth and development. And I knew that being at P&G, which was a training ground for marketeers and brand builders, it was an opportunity for me to grow. Post that, I moved to Johnson & Johnson, first in the Middle East, which is home for me, and then in Europe. And in that opportunity, I took what I learned and I took it to the next level. And instead of just helping to build US brands, I was now involved in building global brands. So I found myself traveling across Europe, across different sectors, and I learned what it meant to build global brands. I always believe that when you are ready with skills, knowledge, and the network, opportunity presents. And that's what life is about. Life is about opening opportunities. And if you're ready for them, you grab them. If you're not, you continue going down the path you're at. While I was with Johnson & Johnson, I was based in Zug, right outside Zurich in Switzerland. And I got a call from my brother one afternoon. And he had just sold his first records management business in the Middle East. So he was very proud of his exit. And he had this idea. He said, "I want to revolutionize recruitment in the Arab world." Back then, most Middle Easterners were leaving the region because of this perceived lack of opportunity. And he wanted to change that playing field. And he said, "Would you do this with me?" As I sat there looking out at the Alps and the mountains and the cows and the green, I thought to myself, I'm in heaven. Why would I leave this spot of heaven and go back to the region? But I did. I was ready to go down the entrepreneurial path. The concept was incredibly compelling. When BAIT, it was called at the time, when BAIT would succeed, it would empower job seekers and employers to connect, and it would revolutionize the jobs market in the Arab world. And I wanted to be part of that. So I left Johnson & Johnson, put on my entrepreneurial hat, and the rest is history. And I've been an entrepreneur ever since.
Fantastic. I think it's always, interesting. I think one thing that resonates with me is just, your advice to sort of take every opportunity, because, casting a wide net, particularly early on in your career, opens the door to all sorts of opportunities. So I think that's really fantastic advice. And certainly, the training ground that you received early on as a marketer, I'm sure, in no doubt, led to some of the success and enabled you to build, obviously your first business in BAIT and then Mum's World. If you look back at your time with BAIT, obviously, so you've had two very successful entrepreneurial, endeavors. And I'm sure you probably were able to leverage, a lot of lessons from the early days at BAIT. And I guess to give some people some context, that business was founded very early on, in the internet age. I mean, I think Google was, probably stock price wasn't even, at the hundreds of dollars. And, back in 2010, particularly given the context of the region, that business itself was revolutionary. And as you mentioned, obviously you and your brother ended up growing that, I think, into the Middle East's largest search portal. I think that what I think put most people was, what were those lessons that you learned from the early days? I mean, it doesn't sound like you were a serial entrepreneur, from a young age, and you kind of leveraged your corporate experience, but I think always there's probably things that you learned from BAIT that you then, didn't make those same, I guess, mistakes when you launched Mum's World. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that with us.
Sure. So when we started BAIT, internet penetration in the Arab world was less than 2%. It was the time of the internet bust. So anybody who was in the online world was running away from it because businesses were failing. So for all intents and purposes, it was the worst time to start a business that was not only very new to the region, but broke every cultural rule of the region. So putting your CV online back then was inconceivable, because this region is one of confidentiality. It's one of who knows who. Even movement across the region is very limited. So if I live in the Emirates, finding a job in Saudi or Kuwait or Qatar is very difficult, because you need sponsors, you need special mobility approvals. All of that did not exist. So BAIT as a concept, while the vision to empower job seekers and employers to connect better and revolutionize recruitment, while that vision was a very important one, the ecosystem enablers were non-existent. So rationally, it was a bad decision. And if you were a risk-averse entrepreneur, it was a bad decision. But from an entrepreneur who wants to create impact and who believes that everything can be solved and that problems are only opportunities to resolve, it's a wonderful opportunity. So I was driven by ecosystem impact. I was driven by an opportunity to make something happen that will really turn the needle in the region for or towards people's lives. And that's why I took that leap of faith. And just for perspective, when I flew out of Zug, I actually flew to Egypt. We had a meeting with potential investors. I knew nothing about the jobs market. I knew nothing about the digital ecosystem in the region, nothing. And I sat there with my brother in this VC meeting to raise capital. And it was a crash course of knowledge. I had to teach myself very quickly what I had to learn to get the capital. So the first learning is, we were driven by impact, and we figured out the execution as we went, as most entrepreneurs do. The second is your learning curve has to be incredibly steep, and you have to be driven by learning. And because that is in my nature, this was something that I loved, and that I was able to continue that learning journey throughout. The other thing that I learned very early on is people. And if you're able to attract leaders around you and people who are better than you in things that are your weaknesses, this allows you to move further faster. So I was surrounded by incredibly smart people, very ambitious people, and people who had a similar vision of ecosystem impact as I did. And these were the three, I think, drivers to allow us to succeed early on. We were profitable from the first year. So that also helped us, because success breeds success. As long as you have the capital from profitability, you can continue to drive the engine. So that was important for our initial success.
I have two follow-up questions to that. I think, one, I want to chat a little bit about, sort of building the right team. But before that, I think one of the things that, especially for new entrepreneurs, that's very challenging, as you mentioned, to navigate is the funding process. And, working with VCs or, and talking with many entrepreneurs, one of the things that they learned early on is you also have the right funding partners. I wonder, and I think that's obviously for people who are really, particularly starting out, it is probably the most uncomfortable part of the business, or where the largest learning curve is, as you mentioned, is, yes, it's great to hire great people, but you also have to work with your investors. And so, to that note, I sort of wonder if there's any lessons that you have to share around, I guess one question would be, did you always choose the right partners? And second, if you didn't, what did you look for the second time around, as you went for additional rounds of funding?
So funding is a very a tricky one. I would rank it as the number one maker or breaker of businesses, because at the end of the day, you cannot grow businesses without the capital. And it's a very key to the people element, but you need the funding and then the people. I will share my experience with Mum's World, because that is probably the most relevant to this question. At Mum's World, we started the business with seed capital of $400,000. Just to give you perspective, we started the business when the ecosystem of e-commerce was very nascent. There were a couple of other players in the ecosystem. One of them was Souk, which is today Amazon. Souk had in their bank account $450 million. We had, again, $450,000. And there was another vertical for clothes in the market that had just launched around the same time we did. They launched with $60 million. So we did not have a lot of capital, and e-commerce requires a lot of capital. What that $450,000 got us is it got us 2 months of proving our concept. We then took that proof of concept out into the market, and we started talking to institutions, brick and mortar institutions, because we knew that ultimately we would need the support of brick and mortar institutions to support us. We put a shareholder agreement together. We went out there and knocked on the doors of the large ones, and we very, very quickly got a seed round of $2 million. And this happened super fast. So suddenly our egos are inflated, thinking, wow, we have a brilliant idea, a brilliant proof of concept. We were able to raise $2 million from an institution, from a brick and mortar institute, super fast. Fast forward a year later, we went out there again and we raised another small round. Again, we were oversubscribed. So we had a business that had caught momentum very quickly. Customers who were using us loved us. We were first to market. We had a disruptive idea, and we were in an ecosystem that was nascent that we were shaping. So we had all of the elements that created for a wonderful story. And more important than that is we had unit economics that were very, very solid. And this is something that is very important for businesses that don't have a lot of capital. If your unit economics speak for themselves, raising that capital becomes easier. When we went out there for our B round, that's when it got difficult. We were asking for more money, and our business was still not on the trajectory that the region that is very VC limited understood. And e-commerce globally at the time was still frowned upon. It was considered to be very cash intensive. Nobody was profitable, high risk. It was a trend that was hit or miss. So investors around the world didn't get it, didn't trust it. And investors in the Middle East region, the very limited, did not like e-commerce. So we went out to raise our B round about 6 months before we needed the money. Fast forward a year later, we had still not raised the capital. We had local VCs, PEs, institutions all telling us, no, e-commerce is too expensive. Meanwhile, we had a business that was tripling in gross revenue. So we had a business that was doing incredibly well, but VCs simply did not want to go down the path of e-commerce. And we had to teach ourselves very, very quickly how to be efficient in how we operated. We had to be very diligent in hiring the best of the best, who were sold on our vision, who we could afford, and who weren't making mistakes when you don't have a lot of capital. We did raise the B round eventually, and that's when we started making compromises in our choice of investors. And this is the first kind of learning. The minute you start compromising your investors is when you kind of go down this very risky slope, because at the end of the day, your investors are driving the ship with you. They are driving your vision with you, they're driving your mission with you, and they're driving your profitability, unit economics with you. And if they are not aligned with you, you will have clashes. And this is where businesses begin to crash and burn. Luckily, we were able to overcome. We were able to find alignment. It wasn't an easy path at all. A lot of my time personally was involved in managing conflicting objectives, varying visions. My job was in ensuring that all of the investors were aligned with our vision as founders. And we got there, but it was a painful journey. And then we raised our C round, and then we went through our acquisition. So finding the right investor will remove a lot of friction, will remove a lot of pain, and will allow you to continue growth trajectory in a smoother way.
As you mentioned, one of the things that, obviously is at the heart of what we teach at our school is really, the importance of, mission and vision. I think a lot of companies, they kind of, put it up on the wall and, it's a nice thing, but it's not something that they, live and breathe. So, I know we've talked a little bit about the funding of Mom's World, but would love to hear, how you developed that initial vision from Mom's World. Sort of, what was that moment? Because as you've explained, it's, and we'll talk about it. Not only is it the challenges, that you faced in the nascent e-commerce market, but, focusing on a female consumer was new for the region, building a company that, served that consumer base, as well as employing, the majority of your workforce as women. So, and kind of rolling back time and thinking about, what was that, what was it that really struck you at the time as the need for Mom's World, and then what was the initial vision and mission that you have laid out?
So I was one of as I mentioned, I was one of the co-founders at Bait. At the time, I had 3 children, all under the age of. So my youngest actually at the time was 4, and my twin boys were 8, so they were all under the age of 10. So for all intents and purposes, I was a very busy person. I had no bandwidth to do anything else. But on one side, I was a mother and a consumer. On the other side, I was an entrepreneur. And as an entrepreneur, it was very clear to me that there was a need gap in the market that was not being addressed. And as a consumer, I was the one feeling that pain point. So the needs in this part of the world that weren't being addressed at that time was access to quality choice of products was very limited. We had a very fragmented, proliferated region. Finding the right products, very, very tough. In Saudi Arabia, women didn't drive at the time. So accessing basic consumables like diapers and milk was difficult. That was one problem. The other problem is this part of the world is a distributor-led region. That means that if I buy a Lego in the US for $10, in this part of the world, it's $50. So prices were very high. And for mothers who have to buy so many essentials, price is important. The other one is content. Mothers are risk averse. They're information hungry. They want the best for their children. They want to feel empowered that they're making the best choices. Content was scarce. Arabic content was non-existent. Lastly, community of mothers who like to share, who are very viral, who like to dialogue, compare and contrast. That community of mothers did not exist. So what we wanted to do is to solve for these problems and create a platform. And as a mother, I wish that there was a platform that would allow me to find the widest choice of product at the best everyday low prices that I can access at the tip of my fingers, and a community of mothers that I can share and dialogue with, ultimately to empower me as a mother to make the most informed decisions for my children. Because I knew that as a mother, if I'm empowered, my children would be empowered. And when you empower a child, you're changing the ecosystem. That was the vision. So ultimately, we wanted to become the indispensable extension of a mother's life and empower her to make the most important decisions for her children. For me, that need gap was put on paper. On the other side, if you look at the global trend of e-commerce was a $1.6 trillion industry growing at 29% CAGR. It was the biggest trend of the decade globally. Brands that were not online were losing their market share and were fast becoming obsolete. So we had e-commerce that was reshaping the retail landscape globally. You had consumers whose needs were not being met. The most important consumer, the gateway into the household, the mother. And so I knew that we could solve these problems through this trend of e-commerce. And so we married the two together to create Mum's World. I wrote the business plan in the summer of 2011, initially with no intention to launch the business myself. I was already, again, a founder of a business that needed my time. I was a mother, but I knew that this business idea was a very important one for the region and that it was a business idea that had to be launched. My tipping point personally, and again, I come back to saying, fate would have it, when you're ready, things happen. This business plan was on my desk, and fast forward a few weeks after I had written it, I was standing in our community, looking at my twin boys, who, like I said, were 8 years old at the time, standing, holding hands, while all of the children in the neighborhood were riding their bikes. The reason my boys were not riding their bikes is because I was a busy mother. I had no time to buy my 8-year-old bicycles. And when I saw that view, I said, you know what? If I do nothing but launch Mum's World to empower me as a mother to be a better version of myself, then that's success enough. And that's when we decided to go down this path, and we launched it in beta. We incorporated the company in August, launched it in beta 2 months later in October, and went live in November.
That's a fantastic story. Obviously, fate always has a way, as you said, of stepping in. And, I think, for many entrepreneurs that we talk to, it is, the right lightning force of something that just strikes them with enough passion that they just, can't put it down. And obviously the right sort of economic and financial landscape as well. I think the other thing is, it's not just in reading is not just the platform that you built and filling the consumer need, but in terms of, Mum's World, I think creating a place for female professionals, number one, as an opportunity, wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, did you set out initially to have such a large percentage of your management team and the overall workforce, be females? I mean, was that all, or did that kind of, come second?
So as an entrepreneur and as a founder, you want to drive success. And while driving for success, you're driving, obviously, people around you on merit. And as a woman, obviously, I have a lens that is biased towards women for two reasons. One is women constitute 50% of the population, so they should represent 50% of your workforce by de facto. That's the first. The second is, as a woman myself, I know my skills and my strengths, and I believe fundamentally that women in their nature are able to are strong problem solvers, are able to juggle a lot. And I feel that the resilience of a woman is quite unique. Not to say that a man isn't resilient, but a woman has an element of resilience that the entrepreneurial landscape requires. So when I set up the first team, the first person I called when the business plan was confirmed was someone I knew very, very well in the Saudi market. She was a Cambridge grad. I've known her for many, many, many years. Super smart, one of the most resourceful people I know. She was actually an investment banker, so she had nothing to do with e-commerce. But she had all of the psychographics that make for a successful entrepreneur: the grit, the intelligence, the problem solving, the resilience, the resourcefulness, all the things that entrepreneurs look for in the early days. And she was based in Saudi. She was a mother of 3. And I told her, would you like to do this with me? And her answer was, but the Saudi market doesn't allow women at the time to work. Women in the Saudi market don't drive. Women in the Saudi market aren't in retail. And that was all the more reason why she needed to join. And so she was the first person who was on board because we were reinventing and revolutionizing the way things are done. The second person we got on board was a head of technology. And I said, if we're building a product for women at the core, she must have the psychographics also of our customer. If we're going to be customer obsessed, we need to come in from the customer angle. So that's when we went and we found the head of technology, who was also a woman, which is not conventional. She's the only head of technology in the region who is a woman. So that we broke the mold there. So again, we looked for merit and we found it in the women. So now as we hire, I mean, we have our head of operations is a man, but our head of inbound is a woman. Our head of Saudi is a woman. Our head of marketing is a man. So we have a very equal split today, but at our C level, we are skewed to women, because we found women with the merit, with the customer obsession that the core vision stands for.
And I think you touch on it, obviously, is hiring people who really know and live passionately about your brand. Regardless if it's a female focused product. As a marketer myself, is 100% one of the things that I focus on. I just not to fast forward, but you clearly have just articulated the not only the technological challenges at the beginning, the sort of landscape for those that are not familiar with business in the Middle East, as intimately. I mean, what do you hope that Mom's World's legacy will be? I mean, you've clearly just totally changed the dynamics in the regions, both from I think entrepreneurial standpoint, from empowering women. So, curious, sort of, you've done so much, is that the enduring vision, or do you hope to do more, I guess, as with Mom's World as a platform, or I guess just yourself, personally?
Sure. So for me personally, I've always been driven by projects that are impact projects that turn the needle on positive contribution to my surroundings. So when I was in the corporate world in the US or in Europe, I was not only involved in projects that I felt were important or relevant, but even in my learning journey. My learning journey was about upskilling my knowledge to be able to contribute in some shape or form. When I joined BAIT, it was purely driven by ecosystem impact. What we were able to do is come in and shape the ecosystem for digital. Like I said, we were among the very first digital enablers in the region. What has that created? It has created jobs for the region. It has brought back talent to the region. It has enabled employers in the region. So it has created significant seismic shifts in the way the region operated in that particular jobs market. With Mom's World, again, we are building a 360-degree transactional experiential website that becomes indispensable to the mother's life. We're giving her the largest access to the best quality products that she can tap into for her children. We're giving her content so she can stay informed and make the right choices for her family. We're giving her a community. Today, we have a community of over 2.5 million mothers. We're the gateway into the household. This is mothers engaging in dialogue to support and develop each other. And we are creating ecosystem enablers for the entire supply chain. So today we have over 6,000 brands. We have become the go-to destination for global brands that want to tap into the regional consumer. So as the go-to destination, we are creating a supply chain all the way from the first inbound touch point all the way to the last touch point, which is reshaping the ecosystem. I will continue to be involved in projects that allow us to create jobs, that allow us to obsess and make our customers' lives better, and allow us to create improvements for our ecosystem. Now that we have built the vertical of Mom's World, we are able to build different verticals and to continue to broaden our footprint across different offerings to different consumers.
Fantastic. And since you mentioned, obviously, the topic of supply chain, particularly, during the pandemic, has impacted, I think, everybody everywhere, here locally, even in the last week, between a snowstorm and Omicron, the shelves are not full again, from a grocery store perspective. So I'm curious if you can share a little bit about, specifically, when it comes to supply chain, what your experience has been, during the pandemic and how you've navigated it.
Sure. During the journey of an entrepreneur, there are many instances where, as an entrepreneur, you stand there and say, this is difficult. In fact, out of a 365-day year, you probably stand there 360 days of the year and wake up and say, this is difficult. Okay, so that's normal. But there are a few times, maybe 3-4 times in the journey of an entrepreneur, where you stand there and say, I think this is over. How am I going to recover? You ask yourself, how am I going to recover from that? And COVID was one time, and I'm going to share with you exactly what happened. But before I share with you the COVID story, I'm going to just reverse 2 years before COVID to an instance that happened where we asked ourselves, how are we going to recover? And that was during Eid. Eid is our equivalent of your Christmas. It's the highest sales day of the year. If you don't do your Eid sales, you've missed your year sales. And not only do you miss your year sales, if you don't deliver to that customer on this very, very important day, you've essentially lost all your customers. So we had, as expected, a peak 2 days before Eid, and then Eid day comes along and we had a peak day, and we were all excited and celebrated that we have met our numbers for Eid. And then on Eid day, when our operations team went to the warehouse to fulfill these orders, and at the time we didn't have our own 3PLs, we were renting out of another facility. So we went into the warehouse, and woe and behold, the warehouse is actually locked. We couldn't get in. We tried to call the owners, couldn't get in. We tried to break the door, couldn't get in. Long story short, we were actually unable to get into the facility. The owners of these facilities had closed shop. And so our products, our inventory, our sales, everything was held hostage. And we had hundreds of thousands of customers all over social media, emails, on a rampage, calling us every name in the book. You guys are late, you guys are crooks, you guys are, you name it, we heard it. And how do you solve that? And remember, e-commerce is real time. So if you're not delivering to your customer what you need to deliver on time, then the backlash is tremendous. And that's when we stood there. That was one time when I stood there and I said, how do we recover? We did recover. We were able to get the warehouse open. We were able to mobilize extra team members. We were able to manage customer expectations. So we eventually did recover. So fast forward to COVID. When COVID hit us, that memory was very much at the forefront. And we knew that if we were able to recover that and other instances, we can recover from anything. What happened with COVID is, just as consumers cannot leave their homes, suppliers can also not leave their homes. Warehouse staff, pickers, packers can also not leave their homes. Couriers, last mile, Aramex, DHL, all of the large couriers could not mobilize. So here we were in this standstill where demand went through the roof, especially for our customers, mothers. Mothers needed their diapers, they needed their milk, they needed their bottles. So we had a customer that needed essentials for her baby. Yet the entire supply chain was at a halt. How do you operate? And then meanwhile, within minutes of this halt, customers are already backlash. So customers didn't stop for a moment to think, wait a minute, maybe these e-commerce players can also not move, just like we can't move. The customer expectation is, you have to deliver what I'm ordering. We did recover. what we did is we went and we got special approvals. So we had to be creative. We had to go in, first and foremost, is we had to get special approvals to mobilize team into the warehouses. So we did that. Once we got the pickers and packers mobilized, we had to have safety measures immediately in place. Remember, safety measures for COVID is something new. So we had to be super creative in coming up with what do we need to do to keep our team protected from getting COVID. So we had to invent and come up with solutions to keep our team safe distance, special rules on how you pick, on gloves, on masks, on sanitizers. All of these were things that we were coming up with in real time. The other thing we had to come up with is we now can't depend on couriers. We had to get special approvals to mobilize only our drivers. We had to be creative in how we put boxes outside homes and how we had to communicate with our customers to get their products outside the home, as opposed to ringing their doorbell or waiting for them to open the doorbell. So we had to reinvent, in the space of really 48 hours, reinvent our entire supply chain. In Saudi Arabia, we had in the first few days about 50,000 packages with couriers, 50,000 packages that were stuck with couriers in their warehouses. So we had to figure out ways to basically go to these warehouses with our drivers, take the boxes back, and deliver them ourselves. So what did this all teach us? This all taught us that there is tremendous benefit in agility, in a culture, in a DNA of agility, in a culture of problem solving, in a culture of not being heavy with all processes and systems, understanding that you have to constantly reinvent yourself. You have to constantly be ready to resize your processes and systems. And most importantly, if everybody in the organization did not share that DNA, we would not have been able to achieve this. So everybody in the organization was aligned on that agility, on that flexibility, on that need to reinvent the way we did things.
Well, certainly, obviously, from the experiences that you shared, I mean, clearly you've touched on sort of the topics of, resiliency and leveraging, the culture that you had built, right? Agility and things like that. I mean, certainly if you had not spent, the years building that from the ground up, I think, facing these types of things, pandemic, warehouse being locked, it's just certainly probably wouldn't have happened. And so maybe it goes back to a little bit more to the culture of Mom's World. How did you go about building and reinforcing that level of resiliency and agility? Because I think as leaders, particularly everybody has had to now manage through 2.5 years of a pandemic. And, everybody's gone about it, a different way, and just, sort of the continued fatigue of being resilient and agile, has a grind on anyone. So specifically just from your leadership perspective, what is it that, that you built at Mom's World that has allowed you to navigate these types of crises so well? And literally, to your point, turn the supply chain on a dime in 48 hours. I mean, not many companies, could clearly be able to logistically do that. But from my perspective, from a cultural perspective, finding people to come along with you and sort of manage through the panic must have been an incredible challenge, but one that you had laid such a great groundwork for, that it was probably not necessarily easy for you to get them to come along, but they had a level of trust in you and your leaders.
So we have always hired team members mostly on culture and values first and on skills second. You can't train for mindset. You can train for skills. So we always try to hire people who were entrepreneurially driven, who were problem solvers, who believed in accountability and took ownership, who wanted to challenge the status quo, who believed that everything is solvable. So that mindset goes a long way. And when you have that, you can win. Now we haven't always been right. I mean, we've made a lot of mistakes because, to your point, how do you hire the best people, especially in the early days when you don't have the capital to pay the highest salaries, when you're operating in a market that is underdeveloped and nascent, where you have to build from scratch, when your competitors are deeper pocketed and they can, pay much higher salaries than you? How do you hire for these types of people? Two ways. One is you have to be clear and authentic in your vision. If they are aligned with your vision, they will come with you to the finish line. So is your vision compelling? Is it important enough? And who can you find who's aligned with your vision? That's the first thing. And the second thing is when you're hiring for mindset, again, we always tell people in the interviews, we tell them, if you think this is going to be hard, it's actually going to be harder. You're going to get up every day, especially in the early years, and you're going to say, I'm going to basically go to the office and try to solve challenges and solve problems. And insofar that they are on board with that, they will succeed. But it's tough. The people element of a startup is the hardest part of the build. You lose a lot of good people who maybe aren't able to go the stretch. But to your question directly, how are we able to mobilize the entire team? We lost people. We lost people who said, this is hard, this is not worth it. But those who we didn't lose were the ones who were energized by this opportunity and figured that if I can solve this, I'm better for it. I learn more. I'm a better professional. I become a more seasoned professional.
Yeah, having worked directly for Jack Welch for many years, who's arguably, one of the, best people managers or widely regarded, what you say reminds me of his, framework for hiring, which is the 4 Ps, of hiring is, you're not hiring. Yeah, you assume somebody can do the job, but do they have the energy, the edge? Can they execute? Do they have the ability to energize others, and do they have passion? So that very much, very much resonates with me. And I think the other thing he also told me at one point was that even he, would get it wrong sometimes on hiring, right? And, it's the hardest thing you can do as a leader. And also the most important is really building, that right team. So that's just incredibly fascinating. I obviously had done my research, but was not aware of some of the granular challenges. And so we've only got a few minutes, left here. And I think the other thing that you mentioned, 1 or 2 times that obviously is, goes right to my heart as a marketer is your consumers. I think one of the things you manage was, well, we didn't have to just manage supply chain issues, but we had to manage the public perception of what was going on, with our consumers. And, arguably it's much easier to retain a customer than having to acquire new ones. So how did you, respond to those types of, issues with consumers? Because it really goes to the, you're making this promise, obviously, to your customers that you're coming here because we understand you as a community. And now, even though you're trying to do all the right things from a business perspective, you're getting complaints and you're having to deal with those customers who are so precious that you don't want to, see them or lose them clearly to a competitor.
Yeah. So we have entered a world, and as a marketeer, you are very aware of this, that communication and narrative, whether it's the right narrative or the wrong narrative, spreads faster than ever before. Now with social media and, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, one customer who is disgruntled can mobilize an entire narrative, almost like a fire within minutes that may or may not be right. In this part of the world, our consumers are very, very vocal. I think, all consumers are vocal, but in this part of the world, they are more vocal. And so again, what happens is you have not only a backlash of other consumers when one consumer starts a trend, but it creates a momentum that's oftentimes very difficult to handle. So with COVID specifically, and I mentioned this story of the 50,000 packages that were stuck with our couriers, and the customer doesn't care. At the end of the day, the customer bought the product from you, for you to go and say, oh, by the way, it's stuck on the borders. Frankly, we don't care. That's the reality. And that they're entitled not to care because they paid for the product. So they're entitled to excellent service. And anything outside that is an excuse. So you have to figure it out as a brand, how to solve it. So for us, every time we would respond to these complaints, it would actually work in the reverse. It did not work in our favor. What we had to do is we had to figure out a way to solve it. And so, yes, these customers that we failed, and we did fail many customers because of the ecosystem. And by the way, we weren't the only ones. The entire ecosystem was in the same boat. So that was the only silver lining. So while we did fail some customers, we were able to then, when we did recover, ensure that we would deliver to those customers that remained better. And then later on, when it was calmer, we did go back to those customers that were disgruntled with us with a narrative that said, listen, we're here for you. We're building this business for you. We are also the customers. And this is how we're going to make it up for you. So yes, we were able to convert back many of the customers that we lost. But then at the end of the day, you will always have customers that you cannot bring back. But this is, again, we are in a disruptive ecosystem. The world has shifted. And as brands, we've learned that we have to be a lot more proactive in trying to minimize these types of incidents ever happening again in future.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's saying sorry, we messed up is no longer acceptable if you're not coming with a solution. To your point, there's so much competition that regardless if it's in education or e-commerce, people have a lot of options and will go elsewhere. We're nearing the end here, and this has been fantastic, Mona. So thank you so much. I have one or two questions from the chat, but I wanted to ask you one question, which is a favorite of mine that we like to ask everybody. We're all about the JWMI Management Institute, and what we teach in leadership is, that feedback is such a gift to give people, right? Letting them know where they stand, helping them get to that next level. But, sometimes we receive feedback and it's not that great. We've gotten a lot of interesting answers to this, but what's the most challenging feedback that you've received as a leader, maybe it was early on in your career from a disease, and how did it impact your career?
Feedback that I personally received about myself in my career. I've received so much feedback that is good, bad, and very ugly. Look, I am driven, my expectations of others are never, ever more than my expectations of myself. When I personally commit to a project, as I mentioned earlier, it is a project that's based on what I believe is the right thing to do for the customer and the ecosystem. So I am driven by impact, and I'm driven behind positive change. That's my why. That's my North Star. And in that commitment, I have a commitment to myself, to my shareholders, to my customers, to my staff, that they have a job and a salary, to my children. I wear a lot of hats. And when you wear a lot of hats, you have a lot of responsibility. So when one ball falls, I have to be very stern about it. So, the analogy I say in the early days, when you are a flat organization and you have one bad apple, what happens when you have one bad apple in a tree? In a few minutes, the entire tree is infected. So it is my responsibility as a leader, if I identify a bad apple, to make sure that I'm protecting the tree. So I need to remove the bad apple. So and that goes with projects, with people, whatever. So perhaps one of the feedbacks I've received over the years is I'm tough, and I am tough. And I learned later on in my career that I don't have to make excuses to being tough. On the contrary, I need to be tough to protect all of the stakeholders. Otherwise, I'm not doing my job and I'm not fulfilling my commitment. So that's one of the feedbacks. What other feedback have I heard over the years? For me, look, the customer comes first. The customer comes first. And for me, any reasons why or excuses why we cannot serve the customers, to me, is a bad reason, is a non-reason. And so this is kind of also where I put my foot down and I say, no. So I will veto decisions that are customer driven. And so this is one of the feedbacks I have received, and that's the feedback of perhaps being too much of the North Star, too idealistic towards the North Star. I believe, in my mind, it is in search of excellence. It's search for the non-conventional, for challenging the status quo and doing what others don't want to do or cannot do. And I will continue to drive for that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your candor. We're really at the end of our time here. Again, I can't think of a better way to wrap up and then those last, sort of two pieces of advice and learnings. On behalf of the Jack Welch Management Institute, Mona, thank you so much. I mean, this was so engaging, and we're very committed, obviously, to bringing the global point of view into our classroom for our students, and incredibly fascinating, not just to hear your, the origins of how you became an entrepreneur, but just learning what life is like, as someone running a business in other, in other areas of the world has been incredibly impactful. So thank you so much. It's been a great joy. And we're incredibly grateful for you staying late, after work. I'm sure you've got to get home to family. We could probably talk a lot about work-life balance, but maybe that will be for another session. So thank you very much, Mona.
For having me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.